Turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7. We're actually going to be looking at the very end of that chapter because Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, and then chapter 7, that's the longest sermon in the Bible, Sermon on the Mount. It's kind of a famous sermon. I encourage you to read it sometime. But in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus is, he's talked about a lot of things, and he's talked about you've heard that it was said, but I say to you. So he's taking, he's talking to Jewish people who were very well accustomed with the law of Moses. They had thousands of years of history and tradition, and Jesus comes on the scene, and he kind of says, okay, you've been used to doing it this way, but I'm telling you, this is the way that's really appropriate. And so he's upping the ante. He's changing the rules of the game a bit. But then at the very end of his sermon, Matthew chapter 7, look with me there at verse 24. Matthew chapter 7, verse 24, Jesus says this. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and what? Come on, church, you got your Bibles open? You got your Bibles open in Matthew chapter 7, okay? I'm talking with you, and this is the time of the service when you actually get to perk up and join me, because when I ask you a question, you can answer it out loud, okay? This will be fun. Trust me, it'll be fun, okay? Matthew chapter 7, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Yeah, you've heard this story. You know this analogy. Jesus gives this long sermon with these new expectations, this new set of how to live. He's building upon a foundation that has been well established for thousands of years. But then he's putting his take on it. And what he says is, if you hear these words of mine and you actually put them into practice, you'll be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Verse 25, he says, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. Verse 26, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. So, two kinds of people. People whose lives are built on sand, people whose lives are built on the rock. What's the difference? What's the difference between building on sand and what's built and building on rock? I mean, essentially, isn't sand just rock? Sand is just rock that's been turned into sand, right? It's just little pieces of rock. But folks, you've been to a beach. You've been up to the Great Lakes. We've fallen in love with Warren Dunes State Park up there in Michigan, the big tall dunes, Indiana Dunes. It's a fun place. You go walk along the beach, whether you go down south of Florida Beach or wherever, you've walked on a beach, it's just sand that's been eroded and broken down into little pieces. But the thing about it is, it's just so soft, isn't it? It's beautiful to walk on. It's soft. But rocks are hard. Rocks are hard to walk on. Rocks are hard to walk. Sand is easy to walk on. Rocks are hard to walk on. Have you ever stopped and thought about how easy it is to listen to Christian teaching? How easy it is to hear Christian songs, how easy it is to listen to a preacher, how easy, well, maybe not so easy sometimes, but it's just so easy, isn't it? Just to hear these things and to watch or to listen and to observe. It's kind of easy. I mean, it takes absolutely no effort whatsoever to turn on the radio and listen to Christian radio. It takes absolutely no effort to turn on the TV and watch a guy, or turn on a podcast, or go to a website. And there's thousands of options to choose from. But have you ever stopped to contemplate how really hard it is to walk this stuff out? See, sand is easy to walk on. Rocks are hard to walk on. And yet, when you're building a house, it's amazing to me how when you do go to a beach, especially along the ocean coast, you see these big, huge mansions, these big, huge, sky rises, these big skyscrapers built right on the edge of the ocean. And you know that in order for those things to stand right there on the beach, they have to dig down, down, down deep to put these pilings in, to get to the bedrock, to get to the foundation. That's the only way those structures can stand. Digging and getting to the rock and being able to walk this stuff out even when it's hard, that's faith. That's faith. And so this morning, third installment of this three-part series about spiritual authority. Dr. Rob Reamer shared this phrase with us back in 2019, and it's just been stuck in my soul. He says that spiritual authority is rooted in identity, it's expanded by intimacy, and it's activated by faith. Spiritual authority is rooted in identity, it's expanded through intimacy, and it's activated by faith. So the first week we talked about identity. The world will ask you. The world will ask you who you are. And if you don't know, the world will tell you. I didn't come up with that phrase. That's a famous psychologist that said that. But the world will ask you who you are. If you don't know who you are, if you don't have a clear sense of your identity, if you've not gotten your identity from God, if it's just the world's version, folks, this is America. Everybody has freedom to kind of be who they want to be. And you can change yourself, and you can reiterate yourself. This is life in the modern world. But there are some things that are eternal. In God's perspective, God's truth is eternal. And so if you don't have the eternal truth of your identity being rooted, and if you're not rooted in that, then you're building on shifting sand. But spiritual authority is also then expanded through intimacy, and we looked at that last week. The intimacy is this life of living. My phrase is roof off, walls down. Again, I didn't invent that phrase. That's Norman Grubb's phrase, missionary from the 1950s. Roof off, walls down. The roof off symbolizes there's no obstacles or hindrances between me and God. And then the walls down, there's no obstacles or hindrances between me and a few other people. I walk in honesty. I walk in humility. I walk in vulnerability and transparency. That's called walking in the light. That's called walking in truth. And the interesting thing is that so many people get frustrated because it feels as if there's an obstacle or there's a barrier between them and God. All the while, they don't realize that there is a wall that is load-bearing to the ceiling, and it's a wall that they've built up between them and other people. And so there are some sections of the roof, there are some sections of our relationship with God that will only get cleared up when we deal with our relationship with other people. Are you tracking with me? Does that make sense? Load-bearing walls. The obstacles between us and the Lord will remain as long as there are obstacles between us and other people. And so that's a life of intimacy. That's a life of intimacy. And then we come to this third installment, and that's spiritual authority is rooted in identity, it's expanded by intimacy, and it's activated by faith. Faith is simply putting it into action. Faith is, as Jesus describes here at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, hearing these words of mine and putting them into practice. The difference between the house that's built on sand and the house that's built on the rock is putting into practice the things that Jesus says to do. Okay? You got your Bibles out. Get them limbered up. Get your fingers limbered up because we're going to hop around different places here this morning. I want you to go back to James chapter 5. That's where we were last week. James chapter 5 is this ancient letter that he's writing to exhort and to encourage the church. And this is where we talked about this idea of intimacy, because he says in verse 16, confess your sins to each other. What does that look like practically? What does it look like to live this confessional life? Well, in James chapter 5, there in those verses, I shared a little bit more in depth on these verses last week. He's talking about, if you're experiencing trouble, pray. If anyone's happy, sing songs, sick, call the elders of the church, pray over him, and anoint him with oil in the name of the Lord. And then verse 15, James chapter 5, verse 15, and the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. Faith. Make the sick person well. Faith. James has talked a lot about faith. In fact, earlier on in his letter, if you turn to the previous page, probably right there in James chapter 2, he talks a lot about faith. And he's talking a lot about this issue between there are people who claim to have faith, but really that's all they have is just a claim. And then there are people that actually live by faith and actually do things because they're motivated by faith. And so in James chapter 2, if you look there, James chapter 2, verse 14, what good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save him? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is what? Dead. Jump down to verse 26. James says this. James chapter 2, verse 26. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is what? Dead. As the body without the spirit is dead. Folks, just a simple question here, okay? I'm not trying to trick you. This is a legitimate question. It's an easy answer, okay? Can a person actually live physically and not be alive spiritually? Yeah. Can a person live physically but not be alive spiritually? In other words, can you live a life on this earth? Can you live and be separated from God physically? Yes, you can. You can. In fact, the sad reality, the sad truth is most people on planet Earth do. That's just the reality. Most people alive today on planet Earth are alive physically, but their spirit is not connected to the living God. But what James says is, just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. Because you can be alive physically, but be dead spiritually. You can be alive physically, but dead spiritually. Faith without deeds is dead. Just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without action is dead. James is also the one who made the statement that you say you believe in God. Well, good. Even demons believe in God. So that's just because you believe, okay. But he goes on to talk about how it's necessary to actually put our faith into action. He's not saying anything new because obviously I've just shared with you, Jesus himself said at the very end of his Sermon on the Mount, if you hear these words of mine and you put them into practice. Put them into practice. Spiritual authority is not name it and claim it. Spiritual authority is not the ability to get rich. Spiritual authority is not the ability to have more of what this world can offer. Spiritual authority is all about being connected to the living God and ultimately being his agent in the world, his agent in the world. It's an interesting thing. From the beginning of time, you go all the way back to Genesis. God commissioned the first human beings, the first human couple, Adam and Eve, and said, go, take dominion, subdue the earth. Everything on the earth, I give it, you're now in charge. That's called authority. He gave them authority and said, the earth is yours, go take dominion, and it's yours, I'm giving it to you. But then they rebelled, they sinned. They wanted to choose for themselves what wrong and right was. They wanted to do that apart from God. And the authority that God had given to the humans, now they unwittingly had abdicated that authority and handed the authority over to the enemy. And so the enemy of our soul is now the ruler of this world. Jesus said that. It's buried out all throughout the New Testament. And so it's an interesting thing that from the beginning of time, when humans gave our rightful place of authority to the enemy of our souls, the Lord has had to take matters into his own hands and had to try to initiate this rescue mission of basically saying, okay, I created you in my image to take authority, to be rulers over this domain, the earth. And so now then, what am I going to have to do in order for you to get that authority back? And God would raise up people. If you read the Old Testament, God would raise up specific people. He would raise up specific leaders. He would raise up specific individuals, and he would give them authority. And all the while trying to help people reclaim their place. And yet person after person, individual after individual, nation after nation, king after king, ruler after ruler would ultimately fail on the mission. They couldn't do it. And so God said, okay, I'm going to have to do it myself. And so he left heaven, came to earth. Jesus was born. He walked the earth as a man, full of grace and full of truth. And he demonstrated for us what genuine authority looks like. He actually lived it. In fact, if you go on there if you go back to Matthew chapter 7, the analogy of the sand and the rock, it says there that after Jesus finished this sermon, the people were amazed at his teaching because he spoke as one who had authority. You know genuine authority when you see it, don't you? And honestly, you know counterfeit authority when you see it too, don't you? I mean, we can just tell. We can just tell when people are the real deal or when people are charlatans. Now then, we can't always tell. We can't tell 100% of the time, absolutely 100% correctly. But we generally know real authority when we see it. The people saw Jesus. They heard him speak. They heard him teach. And they recognized that he had real authority. Everything that Jesus did demonstrated that he was the real deal, that he was who he says he is, and that he can do everything he says he can do. But here's the part this is where it gets difficult, because Jesus was crucified, he was killed, he was murdered, he hung on a cross, committed no crime, but he was executed. They took his dead body off of the cross, they laid it in a tomb, and then the disciples are left sitting around thinking, now what do we do? The mission's over. I mean, our leader's gone. I mean, he did all of these amazing things, but it didn't turn out the way that we thought it was going to turn out. But then in the great, irony of history, Jesus appeared to them and was resurrected and said, look, I'm back. If he had just resurrected and just, said, now then, boys, listen to me. If he had stayed in human form, have you ever stopped and thought about this? Why didn't Jesus, when he was resurrected, just come back and stay in bodily form and just continue to do what he had done before he died? Why didn't he do it that way? I want to know. That's the way that I would have wanted him to do it. If you come back to life, then stay with us and let's continue on where you left off. But Jesus didn't do that. He didn't stay in bodily form. He didn't come back to life just to stay alive physically. He did something that makes, honestly, no sense to me. He says, it's better for you if I go away. It's better for you if I go back to heaven. But if I, instead of staying in bodily form and leading you and teaching you as I did before I was crucified, here's what's going to be better. I'm going to give you my Spirit. I'm going to give you my authority. And I'm going to let you take over the mission. I'm going to hand you the keys. I'm going to give you the rights and the privileges. I'm going to give you the responsibility. I'm going to take what was mine and I'm going to give it to you. And the honest truth is, it's hard to walk on rocks. It's easy to walk on sand. Sand is comfortable. Sand is squishy. Sand feels good. And it washes off easily when you run water over it. It's an easy, pleasant thing to walk on a sandy beach. But faith is like walking on rocks. Faith is like digging down, building a foundation, digging through hard work, getting to bedrock. It's hard. It's just hard work. Faith at times is just hard. But it makes all the difference because the rain will come down. The creeks and the streams will rise, and the wind will blow and beat against your house. Storms will happen. And so putting faith into practice, actually doing what Jesus says to do. Think of this. The world is all about revenge. The world is all about, if somebody does you wrong, then you've got to get them back. You've got to make them pay. Some of us actually had family slogans that told us to do exactly that. You know, some of us have grown up with family slogans, things like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Jesus said, you forgive 70 times 7. In other words, quit keeping score. If somebody tricks you, if somebody fools you, if somebody does you wrong, what does Jesus actually say to do? He says to forgive them. He says to forgive people who sin against you. Who in the world would advocate that? Who in the world would tell you, if you've been taken advantage of, to forgive the people that have taken advantage of you? Well, God would. God would say that. That's why Jesus, when he was hanging on the cross, even though he had never sinned, Jesus was hanging on the cross. What did he say? He said, Father, forgive them. Jesus died under the penalty of a curse, and yet he pronounced blessing. And so when Jesus tells you to bless those who persecute you, when Jesus says things like forgive people when they sin against you, when Jesus says things like pray for those people who don't like you and who hate you, folks, he's not kidding around. He's not making this stuff up. He's not asking you to be a doormat. He's not asking you just to surrender rights. Jesus is not asking anybody to be a doormat or to be a victim. Jesus is actually teaching about authority. Remember, after Jesus was crucified and he resurrected and came back to life, he appeared to the disciples and he said, all authority in heaven and on earth has now been given to me. How did he get the authority? How did Jesus get all the authority in heaven and on earth? He got it by letting himself be killed. Jesus gained authority Let me put it to you in very blunt terms. Jesus got more power by submitting to the schemes of evildoers. When he was killed, when he was crucified, when they took his dead, lifeless body off the cross and put it in the tomb, they thought they'd won. They thought they'd gotten rid of this man who was causing all kinds of trouble to the system. They thought they were finally done with him. But what Jesus was doing is he was gaining authority, he was gaining power because he let them do what they wanted to do. And then he rose from the dead, proving, you're powerless over me. I have authority over you. And he pronounced forgiveness. He could pronounce blessing. And so, church, if you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever been lied about, if you've ever been mistreated, if you've ever been abused, if you've ever been molested, if you've ever been hurt, if you've ever been wounded, if somebody has done you wrong, faith is like walking on rocks. It's not as easy as walking on sand, because the easy route of the world would say, if somebody does you wrong, you got to get them back. That's the way the world works. That's like walking on sand. It's just easy. That would be my nature. That's my human nature. If somebody tricks me, if somebody betrays me, if somebody says something bad about me, what do? Walking on sand is, I'm going to get them back. But walking on rocks, building my life upon the rock, actually hearing what Jesus said to do and then putting it into practice, the hard thing is from my heart to pronounce forgiveness, to pronounce blessing, to say, I know what you did. It wasn't right. I'm not letting you off the hook, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn it over to the just judge. Because God sees everything. He knows everything. He hears everything. And so I'm not going to exact my vengeance on you, because I'm going to leave that to the Lord. But as far as me, I'm going to see myself far more like you than different from you, because honestly, folks, have you ever stopped to consider that when we're called to pray for people who sin against us, do you ever stop to recognize that there's somebody out there praying blessings on you because you sinned against somebody? Do you recognize that? Do you know that? Everybody here, I'm going to raise both of my hands. Come on, I'm Pentecostal at this point. I'm going to raise both my hands because there are people out there who I'm the reason why they're having to pray blessings, because I've done them wrong. I've hurt them. And so if they're a real Christian, and if they're actually going to walk on the rocks and build their life on the rock and put into practice what Jesus said to do, then they're going to have to pronounce blessings on me because I've hurt them. And so if that's true, then none of us have excuse. Walking on sand is fun. Walking on sand is easy. Walking on rocks is hard. Pronouncing forgiveness, pronouncing blessing, releasing people whom you want to hurt. That's hard. But if you actually do what Jesus says to do, then you get what Jesus says you can actually get. Peace, joy, love. Anxiety and depression are rampant. People are alive physically, they're alive bodily, they're alive naturally, but they're dead in their soul, they're dead in their spirit because they're not connected to God, because they're not doing the things that God expects humans to do. We're walking around trying to exact vengeance. We're walking around trying to make our own way. We're walking around trying to do our own thing. We're trying to identify our own selves, and we're trying to keep secrets, and we're trying to put up a front, and we're more concerned with looking good than we are with actually being good. And so we're lying, and we're pretending, and we're posing, and all the while then, we're just walking on sand, taking the easy way out. And then we wonder, why am I so anxious all the time? Why am I so filled with rage? Why am I so angry all the time? Why am I so easily upset? And why do I fly off the handle so quickly? Spiritual authority is rooted in identity, it's expanded by intimacy, and it's activated by faith. Faith is actually doing what you know should be done. Some years ago, I was actually talking with a young person who was in a relationship that they knew was not honoring the Lord. But they'd been in this relationship for several years. They're actually high school sweethearts, and now this young couple, they were in college, and they were trying to make this long-distance relationship work because they had years invested in it. But the young woman knew that ultimately this young man, he was on a trajectory. His life was on a trajectory where he wasn't serving God. And she wanted to. And so I had opportunity to sit down and talk with her. And just looking across the table, I said something. And the moment I said it, I thought, I need to write that down because that's pretty good. But what I said to this young woman was, there's sometimes in life where we have to make hard decisions. And the hard decisions are hard because we don't know what to do. But then there are times in life where the hardest decisions, the absolute hardest decisions, what makes them so incredibly hard is not that we don't know what to do. No, they're hard because we know what to do. We just don't want to. Do you understand the difference? There are times when we don't know what to do, and it's a hard decision. But the hardest decisions, the absolute hardest decisions are when we know the right thing to do, we just don't want to. And that, for me, is the difference between walking on sand or walking on rocks. I mean, honestly, I've painted this picture that walking on sand is like an easy thing, but have you ever been on hot sand? Have you walked on a hot beach? It can be uncomfortable. So sand can be uncomfortable at times too. But the only way I know to walk on rocks is to have on a good pair of shoes. And so, fortunately, the Lord gives us good footwear, the gospel of peace. So I have this last bit of encouragement for you. If you're going to actually do what Jesus says to do, if you're going to build your life on the rock, if you're willing to do the hard things because you know they're right and to follow after him, all to honor him, Jesus has a beautiful way of giving us exactly what we need when we need it. Because walking on rocks may be hard, but Jesus has a beautiful way of giving us appropriate footwear and literally clothing us with righteousness, clothing us with the full armor. We've studied Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 6, he talks about the full armor. And literally, he gives us the shoes of the gospel of peace. There is a peace that comes from the good news. There's a peace that comes when we know that we're doing the right thing, even when it's the hard thing. There's a peace. There's a peace that transcends understanding. That means it doesn't make sense rationally. It doesn't make sense naturally. There's a peace that the Holy Spirit delivers to our spirit, where he witnesses to our spirit that yes, we're his children. Yes, we belong. Our identity is rooted. It's established. It can't be shaken. And he speaks those moments. He speaks to us in those moments of intimacy where we commune with him and fellowship with him. And he tells us what the right thing to do is. And even when it's hard, folks, I've said that Jesus, if you'll just tell me what you want, I don't care how hard it is. If I just know that it's you, if I know that it's you, that'll make all the difference. I don't care how hard it is. If I just know that it's you, because I know that if it's you, you'll go with me. And I won't have to do it alone, but we'll do it together. Because, church, he never throws you out there and expects you to do it alone. He always says, I'm with you. That's what I love. That's what I love about God. That's what I love about Jesus, is that he never asks us to do anything to prove how much we love him, except that he's willing to walk with us in the process. You know, there's all kinds of examples of tremendous faith in the Bible, and I mean, pick one, any one. You know, there's just all kinds of examples of tremendous faith in the Bible. It's full. The Bible, this book, is full of examples of people who did great things with God. But the interesting thing is that all of them had to follow this course of figuring out who they were and who the Lord was. And a lot of times they even wrestled with that question. Who are you? Who am I? They literally, I mean, think of Moses, who am I that you would call me? Who are you? I mean, there's this great question time. Anytime God chooses somebody, there's this issue of identity that has to be taken care of. And then there's this process, this walking. Normally it involves going out into the wilderness someplace. Normally it involves going out away from people, alone, where the Lord just speaks and he just deals with you very personally in the quietness, in the aloneness. Normally in some hard, rocky places, ironically. And then there comes that point in time where, okay, it's time to go and do it. Let's do this. And it's always amazed me that whenever somebody is considered a hero, whether it's a fireman or a police officer or a serviceman or whoever it is, every once in a while we'll catch wind of a story and we'll label people. We'll give them that title. You're a hero. You're a hero. You've done something amazing. You've done something wonderful. Normally at the risk of their own life in order to save other people. And so we give them that title, the hero. And then what's interesting to me, it's fascinating me through the years, whenever that person who gets the title hero gets interviewed, they almost always say the same thing. You know what they say? I was just doing my job. I was just doing what I had been trained to do. I was just doing what was appropriate and normal and expected in that situation. But interestingly enough, few people do that. The exceptions are the ones who actually do it, and then we give them the label hero. Church, if you could just do what Jesus said to do, if you just did the ordinary, normal, expected, average thing of just hearing God and putting into practice what he said, that would not be normal or ordinary. That would be exceptional. If a church, if a group of people, if Westview Alliance Church could just hear from the Lord and do what he said to do, folks, we would call that revival. We would call that an awakening. We would call that an outpouring. We would call that a supernatural encounter. If we actually, truly just walked on the rock and built our life on the rock. And if we were willing to do the hard things just because we knew they were the right thing. Graham, would you come up and lead us in a time of reflection and response? And church, I'm going to just invite you just to take this opportunity to do some business with the Lord. Graham's going to facilitate a time of reflection and response. And